Throughout the second half of 2025, Israel appeared increasingly isolated on the international stage. The most striking signal came when Netanyahu attended the 80th UN General Assembly on Friday, September 26th. When his name was announced, a calm, coordinated, and massive movement unfolded across the hall as hundreds of diplomats from more than 50 countries rose from their seats. Delegates from European nations that for decades had been Israel's partners, along with representatives from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, walked out in silence. The scene, broadcast live worldwide, captured a moment in which empty chairs became the central metaphor for Israel's position on the world stage, a void of support in a space meant to be filled by allies and partners. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, facing rows of empty seats left by more than 100 diplomats, proceeded with a speech that seemed designed not to persuade, but to challenge. The core of his message was a total rejection of the growing international consensus. He called the two-state solution madness. To underline his point, Netanyahu used a provocative analogy aimed directly at his American audience. He claimed that giving Palestinians a state 1 mile from Jerusalem after October 7th was like giving Al-Qaeda a state 1 mile from New York City after September 11th. It was clear that his words were no longer addressed to the diplomats in the room or to European leaders who had already walked out. Instead, his primary audience was his political base in Israel and his remaining supporters in the United States, particularly within the Republican Party. By framing opposition to a Palestinian state as a post-9/11 security necessity, he sought to rally support from the most pro-Israel segments of U.S. politics and shift the debate from Palestinian rights to the war on terror. Even more shockingly, the Prime Minister's office directed the Israeli military to broadcast the speech into Gaza. Large loudspeakers were mounted on trucks at the Israeli border, blasting Netanyahu's words into a devastated Palestinian territory. The government also claimed it had hijacked the mobile phones of Gaza residents and Hamas members to broadcast the speech live, though this claim could not be independently verified by journalists on the ground. Walkouts at the UN are of course not new. They have long served as a form of diplomatic protest. In 2022 and again in 2025, dozens of diplomats staged walkouts when Russian representatives spoke, protesting the invasion of Ukraine. In 2010 and 2011, Western delegations led by the United States walked out when Iran's then president delivered conspiracy theories about the 9/11 attacks. However, the walkout against Netanyahu in September 2025 was fundamentally different and far more significant. The key difference lay in who participated. Previous protests usually involved blocs of nations already divided ideologically, for example, the West versus Russia or the West versus Iran. In contrast, this walkout brought together a broad and diverse coalition, including many of Israel's traditional allies and partners. The presence of European countries such as France and Germany among those who walked out signaled a fundamental shift in relations, not just opposition to a single policy. This was not merely adversaries protesting adversaries, but friends and partners openly withdrawing their support. This was also the second time Netanyahu faced a walkout at the UN General Assembly, following a similar event in 2024, evidence of Israel's deepening isolation. The much larger and broader 2025 walkout made clear that even Israel's most loyal supporters in Europe had finally run out of patience. The climax of this European shift came on September 22, 2025, at the UN podium. French President Emmanuel Macron, one of the architects of the New York Declaration, announced that France officially recognized the State of Palestine. The timing and setting of this announcement were deeply symbolic, coming just days before Netanyahu's speech, destined to be met with a walkout. The dramatic walkout at the General Assembly was not an isolated event. It echoed a diplomatic earthquake that had occurred 2 weeks earlier in the same hall. On September 12, 2025, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration with an overwhelming majority, offering unprecedented global support for a roadmap to an independent Palestinian state. When the resolution backing the New York Declaration came to a vote, the result was a resounding rejection of the positions of Israel and the United States. The resolution passed with 142 nations in favor, 10 against, and 12 abstentions. Major European nations such as France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada, along with global powers such as China, Russia, India, and Brazil, supported it. Meanwhile, aside from Israel and the US, the countries that voted against were small states with little weight on the world stage, such as Argentina, Hungary, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Paraguay, and Tonga. This demonstrated just how isolated the US and Israel had become. The most significant diplomatic shift for Israel in 2025 did not come from its traditional enemies, but from the heart of its Western alliance. For decades, Israel's ties with Europe had been built on shared values, deep economic cooperation, and mutual understanding of Israel's security needs. But the protracted war in Gaza, combined with the rhetoric and actions of Israel's right-wing government, drove a deep fissure into that foundation. By late 2025, that fissure had widened into a chasm, as major European nations moved from being critical partners to applying active and tangible pressure over the course of months. As civilian casualties in Gaza mounted, European leaders issued increasingly concerned statements, but often hesitated to take concrete actions. The turning point came with a sharp joint statement by British leaders on May 19, 2025, marking the end of diplomatic ambiguity. Using language typically reserved for hostile states, they declared their strong opposition to Israel's expanded military operations in Gaza, calling the level of human suffering intolerable and condemning Israel's escalation as entirely disproportional. They specifically targeted Israel government policies, labeling the blocking of humanitarian aid as unacceptable and potentially in violation of international humanitarian law. They further denounced the vile rhetoric recently used by Israeli officials, who threatened the forced displacement of civilians, stressing that permanent displacement would constitute a violation of international law. The statement concluded with a clear ultimatum: "We will not stand by while the Netanyahu government pursues these heinous actions. If Israel does not halt renewed military offensives and lift restrictions on humanitarian aid, we will take further concrete measures in response." Yet even in the face of mounting isolation, Netanyahu did not change course. Instead, he introduced the Super Sparta doctrine, a vision in which Israel must be self-sufficient militarily and economically, regardless of the outside world. But this vision triggered panic at home. The Israel's technology sector was hit particularly hard. Business leaders worried, as their industries depended heavily on international markets, capital, and collaboration, especially with Europe. The only remaining bright spot for Netanyahu was the Abraham Accords, normalization with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. Yet even these relationships had cooled significantly and could not compensate for the loss of Western support.